So, how does a movement go from a small, quiet prayer room all the way to the Oval Office? It's a wild journey, one that spans 3 centuries, crosses entire continents, and it fundamentally reshapes both religion and society. It is the story of revival.
And it all really kicks off with this central, almost unbelievable question. A group of religious refugees started a prayer meeting that just didn't stop for a whole century. So how on earth did that simple act of faith light a fire that spread across the globe?
To get our heads around this, we're going to trace the evolution through 5 distinct eras. First, we'll look at that initial spark back in the 18th century. Then, how it got organized for the American frontier. Then we'll see how revival became something you could actually invent. After that, how its mission grew to save not just souls, but society itself. And finally, we'll land on the modern media crusade we're more familiar with today.
Okay, let's dive right in. Our story starts in the early 18th century, and it was a time of, just dizzying contradictions.
Just try to picture the scene. On one hand, you got the super high-minded thinking of the Enlightenment, all about reason and science. But on the other hand, you have the grim reality of England's gin age, where society was literally falling apart. It was so bad, Parliament sometimes couldn't even get work done because everyone was drunk. And right into that gap steps this small group, the Moravian Brethren. In 1727, they did something incredible. They started a prayer vigil that ran 24/7 for 100 years, praying for a global revival.
Well, it seems those prayers were answered, in part through guys like John Wesley. He looked around and saw that the formal Church of England just wasn't reaching regular people, so he came up with his totally radical vision. His parish wasn't a church building, it was the entire world. He decided to take his message straight to the people, in the fields, down in the mines, out on the streets.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. From everything we know, Wesley's preaching style was super calm, very logical. But the reaction he got, it was anything but. People would just cry out, have these intense emotional experiences. Some even had physical seizures. This was not a neat and tidy religion. No, this was a raw, untamed, and pretty controversial spiritual fire.
And that spiritual fire? It didn't just stay in England. It jumped the pond, crossed the Atlantic, and landed in the huge, untamed American frontier. And here, it wasn't just copied. It was organized, it was turned into a system, and forged into something brand new. The guy who really cracked this puzzle was Francis Asbury. He knew there was no way you could build traditional churches fast enough to keep up with people moving west. So his solution was brilliant. A mobile network of preachers on horseback who just never stopped. These circuit riders got these huge territories and a set schedule, basically bringing the church to the people, wherever they were, and then organizing them into these small, focused groups.
And the results? They were absolutely staggering. Think about this. During all the chaos of the Revolutionary War, most of the established churches, the ones tied to buildings, they were in decline. But Methodism, with its lean, mobile, go-anywhere structure, it was perfect for a country on the move. It didn't just hang on, it exploded, growing by an incredible 180%.
All of this success led to a pretty revolutionary idea, a kind of what-if moment. What if revival wasn't just something you had to sit around and pray for? What if you could actually engineer it?
Enter Charles Finney. And this guy, he was a total game changer. He was a lawyer who became a preacher, and he brought his courtroom skills right into the pulpit. He saw salvation less as some divine mystery and more like a verdict he needed to win from the jury. He even developed a whole toolkit of techniques called the New Measures, like using really direct language, powerful emotional appeals, and the famous anxious seat at the front for people who are on the verge of a decision.
And you really can't overstate how huge of a shift in thinking this was. The old school view, the more traditional idea, was that salvation was 100% God's doing. People were just kind of waiting for it to happen. Finney completely flipped the script. He argued that no, salvation requires a human decision. That was revolutionary. It put a person's individual choice right at the center of everything and turned the preacher into a persuader whose job was to get that yes.
So, building on this idea of taking action, the mission got even bigger. It wasn't just about saving individual souls anymore. Now it was about saving society itself from its biggest problems.
William and Catherine Booth looked at the absolute brutal poverty of industrial London, and they started the Salvation Army to fight a war on 2 fronts. Yeah, they fought a spiritual battle, preaching to the poorest people in the city. But they also fought a social battle, handing out food and shelter, waging a purity crusade against the child sex trade, and even opening their own match factory to give workers a safe alternative to the poisonous conditions they faced everywhere else.
And this radical spirit, this let's get it done attitude, it also smashed through old barriers about who could be a leader. Catherine Booth, who was a super powerful preacher herself, really pushed the controversial idea of women in ministry. And what's so cool is that in doing this, she was actually bringing back an idea from John Wesley himself, who'd argued a long time before that when it comes to spiritual service, gender just doesn't matter.
Okay, and that brings us to the 20th century. This is where revivalism plugs into the machine of mass media. The movement suddenly learned how to use modern technology to get a kind of reach and influence that its founders could never, ever have dreamed of.
Of course, the person who defines this new era is Billy Graham. He was an absolute master of modern media. He took the revival meeting out of the tent and broadcast it from giant stadiums onto radios and TV screens all over the world. This insane level of reach didn't just make him one of the most famous religious figures in history, it gave him a totally new kind of power, political power, enough to make him a trusted spiritual advisor to U.S. presidents for decades.
But here's the thing. Even with all the modern tech and the massive scale, the movement was still being powered by the same intense personal belief that lit that very first spark. You can see it perfectly in this quote from D.L. Moody, a mass evangelist who was a big influence on Graham. It was this unwavering conviction, this belief in something more, that drove all these figures, from Wesley out in the fields to Graham inside the White House. And so, this whole journey, from that 100-year prayer meeting in a little town in Germany all the way to the halls of the White House, it leaves us with a really profound question, one that comes straight from our source material. Has a movement that started with this laser focus on changing individual hearts evolved into one that's now more focused on changing national laws? It's a question that really gets to the heart of this movement's evolution. And, it's focused today.